This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello. Today we're in Lesotho, where garment workers are being hit hard by Donald Trump's tariffs. In Taiwan, we hear about the long-standing tradition of fancy dress in politics and why it's on the wane. At the UN in New York, there are notable empty seats at a summit on the two-state solution. And finally, they come in all shapes, colours and sizes, how potato farmers in Peru are combating climate change. But first, to the war in Gaza. This week, the British government pledged to recognise a Palestinian state, unless Israel meets certain conditions, including agreeing to a ceasefire in Gaza and reviving the prospect of a two-state solution. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reacted furiously to the announcement, saying the decision rewarded Hamas's monstrous terrorism. It's the latest chapter in Britain's long-standing influence in the region. Jeremy Bowen reflects on the key turning points in the region's fractured history.
I was in Ukraine when Hamas attacked Israel on the 7th of October 2023. We packed up fast to head towards the war. It took 2 days, so there was plenty of time to watch dozens of horrific videos on social media showing the war crimes that Hamas had perpetrated. By the evening of the 7th, we'd only reached Poland, but it was clear that this was going to be a big war. Hamas was still inside Israel. The Israeli military, the IDF, was bombing and shelling Gaza. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went on television, vowing revenge. I had no idea, of course, I don't think anyone did, that the war would last this long. But the enormity of events on that day made it obvious that it was a seismic moment in this long conflict. The essence of the conflict has stayed the same. It's over possession of the land between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, the area that makes up present-day Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. But key events mark its course. In Basel, in Switzerland, on the 30th of August, 1897, the First Zionist Congress declared there would be a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The Zionist movement's founder, Theodor Herzl, wrote in his diary, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it." He was nearly right. Israel's declaration of independence came 51 years later. On the 11th of December, 1917, the British general Edmund Allenby entered Jerusalem, starting an unhappy 31 years of British rule. 5 weeks earlier in London, on the 2nd of November, the Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour had signed a typewritten letter to Lord Rothschild. It was, the letter said, a declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations. Britain would view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It was followed by another promise. Nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. He meant the majority, Palestinian Arabs, though he didn't name them. The omission still causes so much resentment that 108 years later, Hussam Zomlot, the Palestinian representative in London, brought it up this week when he welcomed Britain's plan to recognize a Palestinian state. Britain kept its promise to the Jews, though not as unequivocally as they'd have liked. Britain broke its promise to the Arabs. In another sign that history lives and breathes and drives this conflict, Balfour's successor as Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, felt it necessary at the UN this week to issue what amounted to an apology for the contradictory promises in the Balfour Declaration. Britain, he said, could be proud of helping to lay the foundations of a Jewish homeland. But breaking the promise to Palestinians, and unlike Balfour, he used the word, was, he said, a historical injustice which continues to unfold. Britain crushed a revolt by Palestinians between 1936 and 1939 with all the force it used around the world to control its empire. Palestinians lost a generation of leaders. In November 1947, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Israel's declaration of independence came 7 months later. More than 700,000 Palestinians fled their homes or were forced out by the victorious Israelis. Only one of all the other significant junctions on the road that led to the 7th of October 2023 seemed genuinely hopeful for both sides for a while. At the White House on the 13th of September 1993, a beaming President Bill Clinton presided over handshakes between the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. It started a few years of real hope that peace was possible through the two-state solution. That's the idea of splitting the land into an independent Palestine alongside Israel. Then on the 4th of November 1995, Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli extremist opposed to returning land to Palestinians. With Rabin, the process might have failed. Without him, it finally expired with a disastrous summit and another Palestinian uprising in 2000. Since then, the words two-state solution have become an empty slogan. Britain, France, and Canada's plan to recognize a Palestinian state is trying to breathe new life into the idea. Along with the other countries who signed a new diplomatic initiative in New York, they realize that there is not much time left to revive the idea of peace after nearly 2 years of war in Gaza, horrific bloodshed, and now a humanitarian catastrophe. When I asked a Palestinian businessman on the West Bank this week whether British recognition of the idea of a state would make their lives better by creating a real one, he answered, "Thanks, Britain, but it's too late."
Jeremy Bowen. It was in New York that Saudi Arabia and France hosted a summit this week to rekindle plans for a two-state solution as a means to find peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Dozens of countries were in attendance and together proposed a phased plan to end the nearly 8-decade conflict and the ongoing war in Gaza. Israel boycotted the meeting, while the White House called the summit ill-timed and anti-Israel. Tom Bateman was at the UN.
Looking out over the United Nations General Assembly, we pointed our camera trying to see the seats allocated for the United States. When you're in this hall, you feel its almost unreal vastness, like something out of a science fiction film, a global forum for the future, with each member taking their turn at the lectern, every nation from Andorra to Zambia getting their say. But the United Nations is showing its age. Established norms are being put under immense strain, and the international order, encapsulated in the past vision of the UN, is dividing. We focused our camera on the US seat and zoomed in. It was empty. The global leader wasn't here to hear the words of its allies. The 3-day meeting held this week was called the High-Level International Conference for the Peaceful Settlement of the Question of Palestine and the Implementation of the Two-State Solution, a long name for an effort to end an old war. It was organised by France and Saudi Arabia. Behind the scenes, officials rallying this effort told me how the situation on the ground in Gaza was creating an inflection point. They saw this as a last-ditch attempt to try to reforge a long-term end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, using politics in place of unending war, occupation, displacement, hostage-taking. The reason for that is that countries can see how the Hamas attacks of October the 7th and Israel's ensuing offensive have given prominence to some of the most extreme forces in both societies. In the face of growing calamity, countries were prepared to do something the US had warned them against. My phone buzzed as we paced our way back to the International Press Corps. Quite the policy shift was coming, I was advised by sources, before the UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy took to the stage in the giant hall. Pausing for a certain dramatic effect as his voice resonated through that space, he said it was with the hand of history on his shoulders that the UK would recognise an independent Palestinian state in September. It would do it, he said, unless Israel acted to end the appalling crisis in Gaza and committed to a long-term, sustainable peace based on a two-state solution. The move, like the pledges of France and Canada, exposed a strategic vacuum in Washington. America has a unique ability to influence, to pressure the Israeli government. It tried to under the Biden administration. In late 2023, a month into the war, the then Secretary of State Antony Blinken laid out a series of what were, in fact, American limits on Israel's military campaign and how to try to win the peace. They were known as the Tokyo Principles. Mr. Blinken said there could be no forcible displacement of Palestinians, no Israeli reoccupation of Gaza after the war ends, no attempt to blockade or besiege Gaza, a future governance that must be Palestinian-led, involving the internationally backed Palestinian Authority, no role for Hamas. The conditions were mostly the US's red lines on its support for Israel, provided in the form of huge shipments of arms. In the longer term, the US remained committed to a two-state solution. Few probably remember Blinken declaring his Tokyo Principles, least of all the Trump administration, which promptly jettisoned them. Biden faced much dissent, not least from his own base, at the level of support his administration continued to give Israel, even as the Palestinian civilian death toll soared. But it did act, on at least 3 occasions, to force the Israeli leadership to let more aid into Gaza. On at least 2 of these, as experts feared a looming hunger crisis, Blinken threatened to restrict the weapons supply if Israel didn't let more trucks in. It promptly responded. There has been no such pressure from the Trump administration, which has accelerated the supply of arms to Israel since January without apparent condition. Now, with an Israeli-American-backed militarized aid system deployed in Gaza, the UN is sidelined, and both Hamas and Israel blame each other for the deadlock in talks to get a ceasefire and hostages freed. Palestinians are starving, and Israel's far-right flank in the government wants to permanently occupy the Gaza Strip and expel Palestinians. Diplomacy, using leverage and incentives for a longer-term path to 2 separate states for Israelis and Palestinians, is being punished, not pursued, by Washington. At the UN, Europe has been trying to rekindle that process and empower the moderates in the region. But in the once futuristic hall of the United Nations, a place supposed to prevent the wanton destruction of wars past, seats are empty and those still talking are left on the sidelines.
Tom Bateman. Next to Lesotho, a country Donald Trump once claimed nobody has heard of, which has been feeling the sharp end of his trade policy. Back in April, the Southern African Mountain Kingdom had been threatened with tariffs of 50%, a seismic shift from its previous agreement, which allowed it tariff-free access to the US market. Just this week, the White House lowered that to 15%, but the uncertainty has already led to many job losses for factory workers, finds Shingai Nyoka.
It's a dark winter's morning, and among the traffic, I can just make out the silhouettes of hundreds of people trekking to the industrial zone. Maseru has a calm, small-town feel, with majestic mountain vistas at every turn. It's incompatible with the sense of hopelessness that statistics suggest. A suicide rate 10 times greater than the global average, and high unemployment. 1 in 2 young people here has never worked. I'm heading to the town's factories to hear what impact the threat of US tariffs will have on this fragile nation. A wailing siren signals the start of a shift as workers file into a garment factory. At another, I see workers, mainly women, in puffer jackets and beanie hats to fight the cold, camping outside a closed gate. They are looking for work. Lucia Nyapela, a tall woman in her 30s, worked as a quality controller at a Taiwanese-owned factory until a few weeks ago when they let her go. Orders from the US dried up amid fears of President Trump's planned tariff increase of 50%. Oh, that one. She tries to suppress her laughter and shakes her head when I mention the US president's name. The factory gate clanks open and a woman in a red coat emerges and calls out for pocket stitchers and supervisors. A handful go in and the gate clanks shut again. Lucia has been coming here every day for 3 weeks, but still no luck. I'm just praying that God can be in his heart so that he can see this thing that is happening in Lesotho, and it's too much, Lucia says of Mr. Trump. Lesotho was one of the biggest beneficiaries of the US policy of zero duty that supercharged trade between Africa and the US for over 20 years. Massive garment factories proliferated here, and tens of thousands of new jobs were created. Previously impoverished rural women became the backbone of the new working class, churning out Levi's jeans and high-end sports clothes, and even Trump-branded golf shirts for the US market. Now, these same women have found themselves at the sharp end of the US global trade war. Nearby, another factory that's been in operation for more than 20 years has been mothballed. The last 3 months were some of the busiest ever, compliance manager Rahila Omar tells me. 2 million pieces of clothing were produced to get ahead of the tariffs before 1,000 workers were laid off. We were already supplying markets in South Africa, but while the quantities are high, the prices are low, Omar explains. Exporting to the US brought significant profits. The company is waiting to hear the outcome of negotiations with the US, but has already made plans to leave Lesotho. Omar is one of the lucky ones. She has found a new job in a local school. The government told me that 12,000 jobs directly linked to the US exports are at risk, and a dozen factories. Some tell me the problem lies not with the tariffs, but with widespread corruption and mismanagement. The luxurious lifestyles of the ruling elite leave nothing for everyone else, says activist Tsolo Takedi. I put that to the Trade Minister, Moketi Chedile. He claims the fault lies with previous governments. As I stroll with him through the industrial area, a woman calls out to him in Sesotho, saying, "We are hungry. When are you going to give us our jobs back?" "Calm down. We are working on it," he answers laconically. I asked him why the government allowed so much on foreign ownership and aren't supporting locally owned businesses more. The majority of factories supplying US markets are Chinese and Taiwanese owned. The government is working on that too, he says. We are in a bad place, but we are not going to break. Few share his optimism. 47-year-old Aletta works in one of the Chinese-owned factories, embroidering clothes. She tells me how she used to sell vegetables and how the factory job changed her life. Her $160 monthly salary enabled her to take care of her daughter, her mother, and late sister's children. She tells me work hours and pay have been halved as US orders slow, forcing her to skip meals and walk to work to save money. This is too hard, she says. She implores the Lesotho government to talk to America. We don't know how we survive this.
Shingai Nyoka.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Next to Taiwan, where President William Lai suffered a major setback last weekend in a recall vote that had been aimed at removing 24 opposition lawmakers, yet failed to unseat any of them. The outcome is being seen as working in Beijing's favour, preserving the status quo, rather than delivering a stronger mandate to the current pro-sovereignty government. James Crabtree has been in Taipei and reflects on how Taiwan's characteristically flamboyant campaigning style was markedly absent in this latest vote.
It isn't every day you strike up a friendship with someone because they dress up as an oyster. But that's exactly how I first came to know about my friend Wen Li when he was an aspiring political candidate in Taiwan a few years ago. Back then, Li hoped to become an MP for Taiwan's ruling DPP party, which governed the country for most of the past decade. As a young politician, he needed to attract attention. First, he took to walking around with a giant helium balloon tied to his back. Then, he hit upon another idea. His area of Taiwan had an important fishing industry, so he decided to dress up as an oyster, attaching a large canvas shell to his back as he campaigned. I met up with Li recently for dinner at a lively cafe in a mall in downtown Taipei. He failed to become an MP in 2024, losing out to a much less colourful candidate from the opposition KMT. Now he works as a spokesperson for President William Lai, who won the wider election. "Why did you decide to dress up as a mollusk?" I asked Li, back when we first met. It was mostly a gimmick, he explained. He wanted to do something that would make voters smile, marking him out as more than just a typical machine politician. What struck me at the time was the playful, theatrical side to democracy in Taiwan, a country run by autocrats until just a few decades ago that has since embraced political expression with great creativity. In that 2024 election, future winner William Lai and his supporters dressed in shiny Team Taiwan baseball jackets, all in green, which is the party's colour. Other candidates did political cosplay, dressing up as animals or fantasy characters. Lai's predecessor, former President Tsai Ing-wen, even campaigned using images of herself as an anime character, complete with a limited edition figurine. Elsewhere, she appeared on cutesy campaign billboards around Taipei, pictured alongside her cat, Xiang Xiang. All of this came to mind during Taiwan's most recent election, which concluded last weekend. Here, President Lai suffered a major defeat in what became known as the Great Recall vote. Taiwan's election back in 2024 had produced a split government, with Lai's DPP winning the presidency, but losing their parliamentary majority. The KMT opposition, the Blue Party in Taiwan's blue-green politics, then used this majority to block the government, prompting a recent civil society campaign to recall opposition MPs and help Lai reclaim his majority. But the plan failed, and last weekend's defeat was a blow for Lai, and one with implications for the island's precarious position between the US and China, which views Taiwan as part of its own territory. Beijing was pleased with the result, given it dislikes Lai and the DPP, viewing them as advocates for political independence. Washington will be more concerned, because Lai will now struggle to advance new laws, including defense spending bills that seek to purchase more American weapons. What struck me more was just how bad-tempered the Great Recall campaign had been. Taiwan's politics have long been divided between the green DPP and the blue KMT, which leans towards closer ties with Beijing. But the Great Recall showed these partisan divisions getting deeper, in a campaign in which no one dressed up as anything fun at all. Put another way, the theatricality and playfulness that until recently seemed to characterize Taiwan's democracy is giving way to something altogether more bitter. As I wrapped up my recent visit, just before the recall election, I went to see former President Tsai to ask her about the health of Taiwan's political system. A widely respected and level-headed leader, Tsai led Taiwan for 2 terms. When we met over cups of jasmine tea, she seemed reflective but relaxed about the recall process. Yes, Taiwan's democracy was growing more partisan, she said, but the civil society campaign that caused the Great Recall was actually a sign of health. She said a growing proportion of Taiwan's electorate, including many of those who supported the recall, is becoming more independent-minded. These people are not affiliated to any party, Tsai told me. Instead, she went on, these independent voters now watch political developments and decide for themselves what was best for Taiwan. And in this case, they used the recall campaign to create a kind of new balance between the old parties. It's just that In the process of getting rebalanced, she said, with a smile, there can be a little bit of chaos.
James Crabtree. And finally, many of our staple foods are at risk because of increasingly frequent extreme weather. Among the crops under threat is the humble potato, which is vulnerable to both heavy rainfall and heat waves. But some farmers are tracing the crop's ancient roots in search of solutions to help mitigate the risks, as Beth Timmins has been finding out in the Peruvian Andes.
Bright white and dusty lilac flowers as high as my knees bloomed across the bottle green mountains, the steepest I've ever seen. As soon as I jumped out of the truck, petals rained down as 6 Quechuan potato farmers, or Paparariwa, meaning guardians, greeted me with a spirited symphony of Peruvian panpipes, drums and conch shells. It's our tradition to welcome you and make your hearts happy in the morning, Lino Mamani, one of the guardians from the Parque de la Papa, told me, as I marvelled at the intricate patterns on his colourful tasselled poncho and hat. The Andes are home to an array of microclimates, and this environmental diversity means that people here have always had to carefully cultivate crops in highly localised conditions, which explains why Peru is home to some 4,000 varieties of potato. Picture mountainsides teething with terrace fields full of multicoloured potatoes, rather than uniform plots. This diversity can help increase resistance to diseases or drought or other extreme weather. There's a Quechuan word the Guardians kept saying when describing this. Aini. It means reciprocity, today for you, tomorrow for me, and is seen in many relationships, such as those between a mother and child, or a guardian and a potato. The balance and respect needs to be maintained if you want to have a good life, Lino told me. Lino showed me around the collection store where varieties are kept for cooking, drying and conserving before they're planted. Children from the community also come here to learn about the potato's adaptability. All kinds of purple and pink-shaped globules and roots protruded in different directions out of clay bowls lined up to the ceiling, like some botanical bookcase come alive. One knobbly black variety called Puma resembled a big cat paw and had vivid purple swirls when Lino cut it in half. Another with a suitably appropriate name was Llama's Nose, and there was a dark coral-coloured pine cone-shaped potato called Bride's Tears. Eaten at weddings, it is presented to the bride and groom's families after the betrothed painstakingly peel its skin for their new in-laws. For us, it's not just about conserving the potato, it's also the culture of being together with the potato. If there's no potato, there will be no dancing, singing, everything. And if we lose that, then we lose our own identity, Lino told me. The Guardians also keep a seed bank, an insurance for varieties threatened by extreme weather, pests and diseases. The prolonged rains this year, the Guardians fear, will cause a proliferation of one of these pests called Phytophthora, the mould that triggered the Irish potato famine in the 1840s. The Guardians share their seeds with gene banks across the world, as well as giving seeds to other farmers in short supply. As we moved into another room and sat next to a crackling fire, Lino explained that the variety also extends to different planting times for different potatoes. For some, you wait for the howl of the fox, Lino said, referring to the varieties grown by the Chatawiri community. And for others, it's the first cactus flowering. Sitting indoors at nearly 4,000 metres up in the mountains, a strange darkness started to suffuse my vision. My next memory was a dull thud as my shoulders ricocheted between the doorway pillars. As I came to from the bout of altitude sickness, the 6 potato guardians were gently patting sweet-scented ointment into my hair and steadying my breath with an oxygen mask. Lino and Ancieto Joyo, another one of the guardians, each sturdily held my arms for the rest of the interview as the others fed me the most delicious, soft and fluffy baked potatoes I'll ever taste. Nearing the end of my visit, I asked if they had any questions for me. Ancieto wondered if I had any stories about the potato and what they meant for the UK. Still fairly dazed, I rabbited on about the endless appetite for chips and bangers and mash and told them how happy I was to share their potato stories with the people back home. As we left the hut to say goodbye amongst the potato plants, they played a song for the flowering season and we danced as the warm rain began to fall. We play these tunes to ask the sky to give us a little sun, Lino told me, and we walk around the fields, to cheer up the potatoes so they can get a little bit of music and be happy.
Beth Timmins, and that's all for today. We'll be back again next Saturday morning.
Our culture
Do
can
join
cancel
us.
someone in the blink of an eye. Celebrities, sports stars, politicians, influencers, and royalty can all find themselves in the firing line. In the age of AI-generated evidence, lawsuits written in legalese you need to pass the bar to decipher, how are you supposed to separate the fact from the fiction? That's where we come in. I'm Anushka Matanda-Dowty, and this is Fame Under Fire from BBC Sounds. We'll myth-bust, debunk, pre-bunk, fact-check, and get to the truth behind the timeline. There are new episodes every week, so make sure you listen to Fame Under Fire and subscribe on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Hello. Today, love motels in the Brazilian city of Belém had to ditch their erotic decor and undergo a revamp due to an accommodation shortage for delegates at the COP summit. Filipinos are counting the cost of 2 typhoons in recent weeks, and the misuse of flood defence funding is stirring anger. And in Tanzania, we hear a witness account of the protests that erupted after the country's recent elections, in a country usually known for its political stability. But first, Syria's interim president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, was welcomed to the White House this week, an extraordinary turnaround for the former jihadi fighter who was previously designated a terrorist by the US and had a $10 million bounty on his head. That was before he led a rebel coalition to power in Damascus last December, sweeping away Syria's longtime dictator, Bashar al-Assad. During al-Sharaa's visit to Washington, it was announced that Syria will join the coalition of 90 countries trying to eliminate the remnants of the Islamic State group. The IS threat is increasing on Syrian soil, especially in the Kurdish-controlled northeast, where some 8,000 suspected IS fighters remain in jails and 34,000 family members are held in camps. Our senior international correspondent, Ola Guerin, reports now on the new generation growing up in the camps.
The Syrian desert is unforgiving terrain, especially in body armour and helmets. We were on foot, escorted by Syrian Kurdish forces who have fought the Islamic State group for more than a decade. In the Kurdish-controlled northeast, that fight goes on. Now it's a battle against sleeper cells. Their attacks have increased tenfold since Bashar al-Assad was ousted last December. The guards apologised that we were not travelling in their armoured vehicle. It was out of action, so we moved forward without it, step by careful step. We were entering Al-Hol camp, a wasteland of tents, whipped by the wind and largely ignored by the world. Family members of suspected IS fighters are effectively imprisoned in this tarpaulin city. More than half are children. We were headed for the most dangerous area, the foreigners section, which holds more than 6,000 people from 42 countries. In the days of the IS Caliphate, when the group controlled about a third of Syria and Iraq, foreigners came from far and wide. Once we passed through the gates, there was a chorus of banging. "They're signalling to each other that outsiders are here," said one of the guards. "They might attack." Visitors are often pelted with stones. A group of women gathered, clad head to toe in black, faces and bodies fully covered. When we approached and tried to speak to them, one looked in my direction and ran her finger across her neck, as if slitting a throat. The hostility was as stifling as the heat, but there was no attempt to harm us. Many of the women were brought here from Baghouz, the Syrian town where IS made its last stand in March 2019. They've been here ever since, detained without trial, convicted of nothing. The women responded to my questions about IS atrocities with complaints about their living conditions. They pointed to a tap surrounded by pools of fetid water. "A dog would drink from this," one said. "We are being mocked. Is this human rights?" When I asked if the women still supported IS, some glanced at each other but said nothing. "Do you think it will return?" I asked. There was a chorus of, "Inshallah, God willing." Children clustered around in silence and stared, some raising an index finger. This gesture is associated with Muslim prayer, signifying the oneness of God, but it was hijacked by IS. We were on Syrian soil, but it felt like a pocket of territory where IS still ruled. "They live as they did under the reign of Daesh," said the camp manager, Jihan Hanan, using the Arabic acronym for the extremists. It's reflected in how they speak and dress and behave, and how they impose punishment. They still follow the same system. In her office over glasses of tea, she told me the children are the biggest danger because of what they learn at their mother's knees. That includes how to make Molotov cocktails. They internalise what their mothers teach them, she said, and ignore what they are taught at school and in activities organised by aid groups. 2 schools and a football pitch in the camp were recently destroyed by those inside the wire. Many of the young could have a fresh start because they're foreign citizens, but their countries are in no hurry to come get them. The international community is being very remiss in not taking these children, Jihan warns. They won't stay here forever, and wherever they go, they'll be a threat. A Kurdish counter-terrorism official tells me boys aged 13 and older have been removed from Al-Hol after attacking aid workers or trying to escape. They were sent to rehabilitation facilities. Their mothers had no say. I ask if this has been successful. His response is measured. Progress can be made, he says. Some do change. There are some kids who refused to listen to music before. Now they want to hear it. If there is hope, we will always pursue it. Before leaving the camp, we learn of a recent killing. The body of a 14-year-old girl was dumped near a checkpoint. A post-mortem examination found that she had been beaten, strangled and raped. We know nothing of her life, except that she came from Turkmenistan. The camp authorities do not expect to find her killer. The women of Al-Hol won't talk. At a military base nearby, we meet troops from the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. Cold drinks are produced, followed by hot ones. Hospitality is non-negotiable here. The commander tells us IS has stepped up attempts to smuggle boys out of the camp, the so-called cubs of the caliphate. He says the militants fail most of the time. We join the troops on their daily patrol around Al-Hol, bumping along desert tracks in armoured cars. Every few days they spot fresh damage to the perimeter fence, where someone has tried to cut through. Our escort is an officer who has been fighting IS from the start and expects to be fighting a lot longer. He doesn't want to be named. When you look at the camp, he says, the foreigners and the cubs, you see an ideology that won't disappear in a day. You see fanatical women and children as young as 4 or 5 speaking in the name of IS. It's over for this generation. He falls silent, listening to a soothing melody on his car radio. I play this song on patrol every day, he tells us. It helps me cope with all of this. Since leaving Al-Hol, the children have stayed in my mind. They were banded together like toy soldiers, the sins of their fathers resting on their slim shoulders. In another life, they might be spending too much time on TikTok or dreaming of being Ronaldo. We travel to another camp called Roj, where the atmosphere is less tense, but the ideology endures. Staff tell us 3/4 of those here are unrepentant IS supporters. Some are training their sons to fight with improvised wooden guns. The children are the seeds for a new, more powerful version of IS, according to the camp manager, Hekmia Ibrahim. They will be even more hardline than their fathers, she says, because their indoctrination has started so early. She tells me she's not scared of the children, she's worried for them. It's not their fault they're being denied a normal childhood, she says. We feel bad when we see them growing up in this swamp. As we filmed, children passed by on their way back from school. Some raised an index finger. Others smiled and stopped to watch what we were doing. For some of their mothers, Syria's new Islamist leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, is a source of hope, though he has publicly opposed IS for years. When he came to power, families started packing their bags, Hekmia says. They told us, soon we'll be out of here and you'll be in our place. Syria's new president says he wants a peaceful and prosperous country with all weapons under state control. But many Kurdish officials believe an Islamist can't change his spots, even if he can swap his camouflage uniform for a smart business suit. Officials we meet still refer to the regime in Damascus, though now they mean the Sharaa regime, not the Assad one. Some in the camp believe their time will come again. That includes dozens of French families who chose recently to stay in the desert rather than return to French soil. A delegation spent an entire day trying to persuade them to go home, says Hekmia. Only 2 families agreed. The other 40 refused to go, insisting they would wait for the caliphate to be proclaimed again. Roj camp looks unchanged from my first visit last December, in the tumultuous days after the fall of Syria's long-time dictator. But now the children are 1 year older and have spent 1 more year being taught to hate.
Olegerin. Last week the Philippines was hit by a massive typhoon. Typhoon Fungwang forced more than 1 million people to evacuate their homes and caused extensive flooding. At least 27 people are known to have been killed. Yet most Filipinos believe they got off lightly this time. A typhoon the previous week killed around 260 people as flash floods wiped out entire neighbourhoods. Our correspondent Jonathan Head reflects on how the country copes with its vulnerability to natural disasters.
The approach of a super typhoon can be deceptive. We were heading north from Manila towards Aurora province, where Typhoon Fungwang was due to make landfall the following day. Our van was loaded with provisions for a full-on disaster. Food that needs no cooking, sleeping bags, a generator and fuel. Yet outside, the sun glinted off the wet rice fields, and in the distance, the perfect cone of Mount Arayat, one of the Philippines' 300 volcanoes, was outlined against a clear blue sky. At that moment, it was hard to believe that a storm the size of Western Europe, with 100-mile-an-hour winds, was building offshore in the Pacific Ocean. But by the next day, when we'd reached the stunning bay at Baler, the mood had changed. Wild grey clouds textured the sky, and the wind was driving angry waves up the black sand beach, smashing over the seawall, soaking the road and us. All the seafront hotels and cafes were shut. Police officers in raincoats went around to check that everyone had left. People were nailing boards over the windows of the main bank, and in the local sports hall, families were filing in, dragging sleeping mats, children and pets. This is a familiar ritual for poorer Filipinos. They get around 20 big tropical storms every year. A handful of those are so big that the flimsy plywood and corrugated iron shelters, which so many people here call home, can easily be swept away either by the wind, by storm surges from the sea, or by flash floods caused by the huge quantities of rain that typhoons usually carry. So they were bedding down on their mats for the night with surprising cheeriness, knowing they might not have a home to go back to in the morning. Few countries in Asia have infrastructure as ramshackle as the Philippines. The failure to build better roads, better housing, and in particular better flood control, is a national lament and has been for decades. The country's geography doesn't help. 7,000 islands, most of them mountainous, subject to frequent natural upheavals like earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Still, Filipinos believe that those who rule them should have been doing a lot better. That all came to a head in September, when large protests were staged over the misuse of funds designated for flood prevention. The budget for this has nearly tripled in the past 5 years, to more than $4.5 billion this year. Yet in July, much of the Philippines was inundated by flooding caused by 2 typhoons in succession. What happened to all that money, they asked. President Bongbong Marcos responded with a well-publicised visit to a neighbourhood north of Manila, where he expressed his anger over flood controls his government was funding, but which were either unfinished or non-existent. He promised an independent inquiry. The Minister for Economic Planning later said that corruption had claimed a staggering 70% of public funds allotted for flood control. The powerful Speaker of the House of Representatives, an ally of the President, was then forced to resign after he was implicated, though he denies any wrongdoing. But people are still unsatisfied and promising to go back to the streets later this month. Public anger only intensified after 260 people were killed by flash floods on the island of Cebu, which the local governor has blamed on so-called ghost projects, flood measures, she says, which were either substandard or which were never built at all. So, will anything change after this unusually wet typhoon season? I've yet to meet a Filipino who thinks it will. The Philippines has a lively and freewheeling democracy and media, which ensures noisy debate about these issues and plenty of sanctimonious pronouncements on the topic of corruption. Yet corruption is a feature of this democracy, not an aberration. Politics, like business, is dominated by powerful families who need to ensure their relatives and cronies bag positions of influence. And to do that, they need massive sums of money to buy off local power brokers who would otherwise offer their influence to someone else. As in most of Southeast Asia, the judiciary is too weak and itself corrupted to exercise any control over these abuses. As Typhoon Fungwang began sending sheets of rain across the Philippines on Sunday night, people took to social media to make desperate appeals, not to their government, but to God to spare them. On Monday morning, as they emerged from their temporary shelters, there were smiles on their faces as they surveyed the damage. Broken branches and debris littered the roads. Fallen trees leaned against houses which were missing their roofs, and some neighbourhoods were underwater for 2 days after the storm. But everyone knew it could have been a lot worse.
Jonathan Head.
I'm Krasiva Novotwig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Next to Tanzania, which has recently experienced its worst post-election violence in decades. The newly elected president, Samia Suluhu Hassan, was inaugurated on Monday after the country's electoral commission declared she'd won 98% of the vote. In her speech, she blamed foreign actors for the deadly protests and insisted the election was both free and fair. Meanwhile, observers and critics accused the government of systematically eliminating any credible political competition. Victor Kenani has been following the story on Tanzania's border with Kenya.
Tanzania's government shut down the internet completely on polling day. So I was covering the election from the town of Namanga on the border with Kenya, not just to get online, but because the authorities had also refused to give journalists from international media accreditation to cover the polls inside the country. There had been some warnings about the vote, but nobody could have predicted how the simmering tensions could have panned out. We arrived in Namanga on the 30th of October, a day after the votes were cast. As soon as we arrived, we found Tanzanian police in running battles with demonstrators. At the border, there is a strip of no man's land, about 30 meters wide, lined with shops on both sides. A crowd of protesters, mostly young men, had gathered there. They were burning tires and carrying banners chanting, "Hatumtaki mama, ameiba uchaguzi," meaning they did not want President Samia Suluhu as she had stolen the election. Some were throwing stones into a Tanzanian police station a few meters away. I saw about 40 Tanzanian officers emerge from the police station. They began lobbing tear gas and fired their guns in the air to try and disperse the protesters, who did not move. The crowd grew bigger and bigger, and there were running battles, the air filled with tear gas. What followed shocked me. A shot rang in the air, and I saw a young man who was standing barely 50 meters from me drop to the ground. Another tear gas canister exploded a few minutes later, hitting another young man in the face, tearing his jaw, blood oozing as fellow protesters rushed him to hospital. The crowd got agitated and turned to us to demand we document it on film. They started shouting, "Wameua," meaning they have killed. Police pulled the body across to the Tanzanian side of the border. More bullets and tear gas explosions rang out. We left for our own safety as darkness fell and headed to a hospital on the Kenyan side and found other people who had been shot. We watched as another young person was brought in and declared dead by the doctors. Some patients with rubber bullet wounds were treated and discharged. Some with severe injuries were admitted and were taken to Nairobi for treatment. The BBC contacted the Tanzanian police for comment, but they have not responded so far on what happened at the border. After a week of protests, Samia Suluhu was sworn in for a second term and the internet blockade was lifted. People quickly began sharing images from around the country showing dead bodies strewn on the streets and people with serious injuries who were allegedly shot by the security forces. I have seen hundreds of those videos. Some show bodies piled on top of each other. Others show bodies riddled with bullets. In response, the police sent out text messages warning Tanzanian citizens against sharing these images, saying they could be jailed. The BBC has been able to independently verify some of the videos that confirm the killings did happen on election day and in the days afterwards. Many people in Tanzania are too scared to speak of the violence they witnessed on the days they were cut off from the outside world. Many told me they fear state agents will arrest them. The opposition claims that over 700 people have been killed in the violence and called the election a sham. The government has not yet given any official statement on the figures. Police spokesman David Misime blamed motorbike operators and foreign nationals for the violent demonstrations and vandalism. At her inauguration ceremony, President Suluhu ordered the authorities to immediately ensure that people's lives return to normal. She expressed sadness over the violence that had resulted in loss of lives and destruction of public property, describing it as a blot on the country's image. Some Tanzanian families are still searching for their loved ones, while others are preparing to bury them. Tanzania, long respected as a haven of peace in East Africa, is reeling from the violence and shock of a deeply divisive election.
Victor Kenani. And finally, it was 10 years ago in Paris that countries pledged to limit the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Today, the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, says it is inevitable that target will not be met. Global leaders met once more this week in the Brazilian city of Belém for the latest COP Climate Summit, though this time around it was not entirely clear what new and renewed pledges would be up for discussion. Watching on was our climate editor, Justin Rowlatt.
2 huge cruise ships are moored in the river beside the sultry Amazon city of Belém. They were brought in to make up for a shortage of hotel rooms for the tens of thousands of delegates arriving for this colossal UN climate conference. Some of the city's love motels, which normally rent out rooms by the hour, have also been hired to house climate diplomats. Brazil's President Lula da Silva knew space would be short. He chose Belém to make a point. He wanted the talks to take place on the edge of the Amazon rainforest, both to celebrate Brazil's extraordinary biodiversity and to remind delegates what is at stake here. The shortage of hotel space led the Brazilians to move the meeting of world leaders, normally held at the start of the conference, to a few days before it. It meant when we turned up, the vast conference centre, a series of giant tents pitched on an old airfield, was still a building site. The sense of disorganisation deepened when 2/3 of the world's leaders didn't turn up. The leaders of China, India and the US, together responsible for half of world emissions, were all no-shows. Then, on the eve of the official opening, an almighty row broke out among the negotiating blocs over what would actually appear on the agenda. Would there, for instance, be a discussion of the enormous gap between countries' emissions-cutting pledges and what scientists say is needed to avoid catastrophic climate change? It looked like we were on track for another chaotic COP. But the super-smooth president of the conference, Ambassador André Correa do Lago, a career diplomat, negotiated a neat compromise, carving out an afternoon to debate some of the most contentious issues. And by the time the conference formally opened on Monday morning, the builders had disappeared and the place looked spectacular. The Brazilian hosts are calling this the implementation COP, where countries will translate past promises into action. They say they want it to be a celebration of multilateralism, the ability of countries to work together to solve shared crises like tackling climate change, and also to stand as a reaffirmation of the Paris Agreement of 2015, when, for the first time, all the countries of the world agreed to work together to tackle the issue. President Lula hasn't named climate change skeptic US President Donald Trump, but his message is clear. He wants this conference to stand as a rebuke to nationalist politics. He also warned of extremist forces that fabricate fake news and are condemning future generations to life on a planet altered forever by global warming. But unlike past COPs, there is no single defining issue here. Paris in 2015 set the 1.5-degree goal. Dubai in 2023 agreed to phase out fossil fuels. Beleng's agenda is looser. The Brazilian hosts have said they want to begin to draw up roadmaps to phasing out fossil fuels and mobilising that finance for poorer countries. The challenge is that they have no power to compel countries to follow through on their commitments. One of the few clear goals, creating a $125 billion fund to protect tropical rainforests, has had a shaky start. Seen as President Lula's flagship policy, the initiative is designed to make standing forests more valuable than cleared ones. Brazil plans to invest the money in developing countries where high interest rates can generate strong returns. The profits would then be shared between investors and the nations that successfully preserve their rainforests. Last Wednesday, the project was a runner-up for one of Prince William's Earthshot prizes at a glitzy ceremony in Rio de Janeiro. But the very next day, Sir Keir Starmer told President Lula that the UK, which was one of a small group of developed countries that helped develop the initiative, would not be investing. There have already been some successes, though. A group of countries has agreed to work together to cut methane emissions from oil and gas operations, for example. But tackling carbon dioxide, the main cause of climate change, remains the central challenge for these vast conferences. When the leaders gathered in Beleng last week, only about a third of countries had updated their emission reduction pledges under the Paris Agreement. As the conference opened on Monday, it was more like two-thirds. Clear evidence, the COP30 CEO Anatoni told me with a smile, of multilateralism in action.
Justin Rolat, and that's all for today. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
After Anthony Easton's father passes away, he goes through his dad's old suitcase. It's filled with cryptic clues, neatly stacked German money, a family tree he doesn't recognise, and also finds his father's birth certificate, but bearing a different name. From BBC Radio 4 and the History Podcast, I'm Charlie Northcote, and I've been working with Anthony Easton to understand his family's dark history and how they lost a fortune worth billions today. What happened to his family, their business empire, and all the money? Listen to The House at Number 48 on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Hello. Today we head to Jamaica's west coast to see the aftermath of Hurricane Melissa. In the mountains of Uganda, we go tree planting with locals trying to combat the effects of the region's shrinking glaciers. Kazakhstan is experiencing an economic boom. We're in the capital dubbed a mini Dubai with its shiny array of skyscrapers. And in Germany, it's 36 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. But it wasn't the only wall that fell. We see how the Cold War once divided a small village community. But first, Zohran Mamdani swept to victory this week as the first Muslim and South Asian mayor of New York, and the city's youngest in more than a century. The 34-year-old was quick to tell his most vocal critic, President Donald Trump, to turn the volume up, as the Democratic Party celebrated two other wins in New Jersey and Virginia. The question now is whether the party can carry the momentum of these wins over to the national stage. Our North America editor Sarah Smith has been following the Democratic fight back.
It is almost impossible to define what makes a truly gifted politician, but you certainly know it when you see it in action. When you encounter someone who has an almost unique ability to connect with voters in a way that feels genuine and authentic, while delivering a clear, simple, yet also inspirational message. And you can see it in the intense devotion of their supporters. That's what was on display in New York City on Tuesday night, as fans of Zohran Mamdani crammed into bars and venues across the 5 boroughs to watch the election results come in and to celebrate his win. There were queues around the block to get into the Bohemian Hall and Beer Garden in Queens, far more people than could cram into the overflowing venue, where the levels of excitement and enthusiasm were off the charts. There were not only loud cheers, but free-flowing tears as people registered the scale of Mamdani's victory. 27-year-old Anu was crying with joy, as she said people like her have been waiting for a moment like this, that they deserve a politician who cares about us and is like us. I've not experienced anything like this kind of passion among Democrats since a self-described skinny kid with a funny name started campaigning to win the party's presidential nomination in 2007. Both Zohran Mamdani and Barack Obama rose quickly within the party despite their relative youth and inexperience. Both toppled rival primary candidates that came from Democratic royalty. Obama beating Hillary Clinton to the presidential nomination. Mamdani beating former Governor Andrew Cuomo, son of the legendary former Governor Mario Cuomo. But of course, Barack Obama advocated a very different political platform from Zohran Mamdani. The new mayor of New York is firmly on the left wing of the party. He's proud to call himself a democratic socialist, and that's why he has got senior party bosses worried. They know their Republican rivals will use Mamdani's high profile and his socialist ideology to try to paint all Democrats as being far too left-wing for Middle America, despite the obvious momentum he built during his campaign. Donald Trump, who is said to privately admire Mamdani as a slick and talented politician, obviously sees a useful foil in the man he publicly calls a lunatic communist. In the midst of the celebrations over Mr. Mamdani's victory in that crowded bar in Queens, Diana Moreno, a Democratic socialist activist who worked on his campaign, told me, "If you could bottle up this level of excitement, what Democrat would not want it?" She said other Democrats had better get on board. But establishment Democrats do not want to get on board the Mamdani train. They point instead to the victories of women like Mikey Sherrill and Abigail Spanberger, much more moderate centrist candidates who won election as governors of New Jersey and Virginia. The first time I saw Abigail Spanberger in action was at a fundraising event in a golf and country club in Arlington, Virginia. It felt like a world away from the Bohemian bar in New York. Ms. Spanberger was surrounded by committed Democrats who were deeply worried about how Donald Trump is changing America and ready to write large checks to support her campaign. As we were sipping chilled white wine on a terrace overlooking the manicured fairways, it was obvious that her supporters were typical of the highly educated, middle-aged, well-off professionals who now make up the backbone of the Democratic Party. Abigail Spanberger and her good friend Mikey Sherrill are both articulate and capable politicians who did win larger than expected majorities, but they don't have the reach or the relatability of Zohran Mamdani. They certainly don't have his social media appeal. They may not be able to win back the struggling working-class voters who have abandoned the Democrats for Donald Trump's Republican Party. So Democrats this week are celebrating these recent victories, but also scrutinising them for lessons on how to maximise their electoral gains in next year's midterm elections and how to retake the White House in 2028. For all his current hype, Mr. Mamdani will not be able to stand for president as he was born outside the United States. Nevertheless, some argue that his win in New York shows the best way to take on Donald Trump and his MAGA movement is with a bold, unapologetically progressive message. While moderates insist that Spanberger and Sherrill's campaigns demonstrated that Democrats more often win from the centre ground. Jim Messina is one of the party's sharpest strategists, who worked closely with Barack Obama in the White House and ran his 2012 re-election campaign. He told me the future for Democrats has to include candidates of all stripes. He says Democrats win when they are a big tent party that can accommodate people like Mamdani and Spanberger, politicians like Bernie Sanders, as well as centrists who can appeal to traditional Republican voters. Over the next couple of years, Democrats will have to choose who is going to be their next presidential candidate, who will lead their party into the 2028 election, and whether that person can unify a movement that is not yet sure which direction it ought to be heading in.
Sarah Smith. The world watched last week as Hurricane Melissa slowly crashed into Jamaica, causing extensive damage across the island and killing 75 people. The hurricane hit Jamaica's agricultural heartland hard, a region already battered by last year's Hurricane Beryl, and the cost of the damage is estimated to be around a third of the country's total GDP, according to Jamaican PM Andrew Holness. Power is gradually being restored, but many people remain vulnerable and are struggling to find food or fresh water. Neda Tawfiq was on Jamaica's west coast.
Our car struggled up the steep, narrow road that wound through the hilltop of White House. We'd finally made it to the town where Hurricane Melissa made landfall. From the shore, we retraced the storm's path north to where officials told us residents had lost their lives. Below, the clear waters of Jamaica were now tranquil and peaceful, but all around us was a reminder of nature's force and the destructive power of winds reaching nearly 300 kilometers per hour. The once lush green landscape was now completely barren. The trees that dotted the hills were snapped like twigs and sapped of life, if not completely uprooted. The only homes left partially standing were concrete, stronger structures. The flimsy, more affordable board homes were all but destroyed, their remnants strewn around the area. We walked up a dirt hill to the ruins of one home, where we found a few women and young girls joking and talking. Two of them, Daniela and Gabriella, told me how they, like so many here, had lost everything, but they'd escaped with their lives. They showed us where one woman, a 35-year-old mother of 4, had bled out and died from a deep cut to her leg from flying debris. Her name was Christina Jameson. Her house was destroyed in the storm, so aided by her fiancé, she tried to reach her brother's house for help, but collapsed before that near Rashawn Brown's concrete home. Rashawn told us they wrapped her leg in cloth and laid her down as the others crouched for shelter, but there was nothing else they could do for her. Later, we met her fiancé, glistening from the stifling heat and the strain of carrying cases of water and supplies in from the center of town. He had a haunting look of despair and overwhelming burden, but he had to keep moving forward. He told us he was caring for 4 children and his parents with nothing. After arriving in Kingston, it had taken us days to reach the West Coast. The roads were treacherous and unpredictable. We went through receding floodwaters and had to navigate around broken chunks of roadway, down trees, and power lines. One day, we went through what's called Bamboo Avenue, where for 2.5 miles, normally tall bamboo forms a gorgeous canopy. But after the bamboo was shredded by the storm, the resulting debris became an obstacle. Locals wielding machetes tried to clear the route for aid and military convoys. Along the way, we relied on the kindness of locals to update us on which roads had been cleared and which were still impassable. At times, we were completely stuck. The locals didn't complain or honk their horns. They just waited with endless patience. In other areas, they got out of their cars to help direct traffic, especially when ambulances or police needed to move through. As we headed to Black River, what the Prime Minister Andrew Holness referred to as ground zero of the storm's damage, we wound through submerged and damaged farmland. The few bits of colorful furniture or clothing that had survived were spread out on the people's lands to dry. But when we arrived into the main town, which is the St. Elizabeth Parish's commercial center, we encountered a different level of chaos and desperation. The entire contents of Black River's shops and homes had been violently emptied and thrown by the storm. The muddy streets were completely covered in glass, pieces of broken buildings, and any and every object you can think of, from shoes to nappies. By that point, Jamaicans who had been cut off from other towns and who had no way to communicate with anyone due to the power cuts had gone without water and food for days. People around us were scavenging through the ruins and rummaging through destroyed shops to take whatever they could find. 2 elderly women told us they too had come to find sustenance, but they knew they couldn't jostle their way through the crowds to get it. They would wait patiently, just like those drivers stuck in traffic. So too did one man who sat back sunning himself as U.S. Chinook helicopters flew by overhead. Along the roadway, we saw police officers trying to get aid trucks through choked traffic. One of the officers, with an assault rifle slung across his chest, told me he had no idea what lay ahead and that they'd been clearing the way as much as possible. A pastor I spoke to amid the destruction told me they still found ways to joke about the storm. He said the spirit of the people is still there, their smiles are there, and even though they have suffered loss, the spirit of Jamaicans is very tough. With a smile, he said, "I know we will pull through."
Neda Taufik. Next, as world leaders gather in Belém for the COP30 summit on climate change, one of the many urgent issues facing the world is the effect of melting glaciers. In Uganda, glaciers sustain unique ecosystems, which are rapidly reaching the point of no return as they continue to shrink, and communities face a growing threat of flooding and water shortages. In the Rwenzori Mountains, a number of civil society groups are trying to repair the damage to the land and prevent further degradation. Hugh Kinsella-Cunningham joined them in foothills there.
The wall of ice we are walking up looks vertical in the night. I am tethered by a rope to my guide, Gilbert Coulet, and each step is exhausting. We are so high up that we are walking in the clouds, and the beams of our headlamps mostly reflect back at us from the water in the air. After 3 hours, dawn arrives, and with it, a gust of wind. Clouds stained orange by the rising sun swirl and break like ocean waves over the black mountain peaks and ridges beneath us. No longer hidden in the fog, a glacier is unveiled beneath us, and the flowing structures of ice and snow begin to sparkle in the day's first light. This is Mount Stanley, the summit of the Rwenzoris. Known as the Mountains of the Moon, these peaks tower 5,000 meters above the jungles of Congo and Uganda and are home to one of 3 glaciers left in Africa. Beautiful as it is, the glacier is a sorry sight when compared to the black and white archive images I've seen, taken by Italian explorers who climbed these peaks in 1906 and mapped over 7 square kilometers of ice. Less than 1 square kilometre remains, and by 2030 there may not be any left at all. We don't stay on the peak long and begin our descent before the sun has a chance to warm up the snow and unveil crevasses. At the terminus of the glacier, large chunks of ice have fallen off and melt slowly. As the peaks change, so too does life in the foothills. In the village of Kalembe, which sits in a valley beneath the melting glaciers, repeated flash flooding since 2013 has left huge boulders strewn across the land, and the raging waters of the rivers that descend from the Rwenzoris have cut scars into the hillsides, destroying houses and fields. I accompany a joint expedition of Ugandan and Belgian scientists who are attempting to study and improve the lives of mountain communities living at risk of natural disaster. Children watch us and giggle as we clamber hesitantly over rocks and through the dense banana groves that lead to the villages. Dr. John Sekajugo, an environmental expert at Fort Portal's Mountains of the Moon University, is one of the expedition leaders. He is recruiting citizen scientists to capture real-time data from the changing mountains. The volunteers can go quickly to a flood or a landslide, he explains. They upload its map coordinates and inform others. People are more vigilant when the warnings come from sons and daughters of the same community. We are recording fewer deaths when these events occur because people know what to do. With Dr. Sekajugo's PhD students in tow, we pass over a rope bridge for a gully. As they look for places to install flood monitoring cameras, we meet farmer Zepanas Masareka, who points to a brown scar on a mountain. A couple of months earlier, he tells us, his neighbour's home and field were destroyed in a landslide, and the family had to move away. The house was right there, he says, motioning to a patch of dry mud. Most of our coffee plantations were taken as well. The loss to the community totaled 20 million shillings, or more than £3,500 worth of crops, a huge sum to people living here. I'm told that it was a tradition in these communities to have a tree near your house to appease the river and wind deities. But this had a practical purpose too. The trees help ensure the soil did not drain away, and people are once again turning to this tradition for protection. Before leaving the Rwenzoris, I have time to travel along to the border with Congo to meet Benon Bwaluma of the Natural Resources Defence Initiative. Bwaluma walks me along the banks of the Semuliki River, where we shout Swahili greetings at the Congolese herders on the far bank and watch fishermen work. Bwaluma's organisation runs a community nursery with over 50,000 seedlings currently growing. These species, he explains, are all traditionally from the region and are well adapted to flood management, holding the hills together. My vision is that this land will be protected, he says. Anyone who needs us, we help them pick the right plants and trees to recover their land. As Africa's last glaciers continue to shrink, the unique ecosystems and lands they sustain are rapidly reaching a point of no return. But local communities are working with experts to try and forge a more sustainable future in the face of this changed reality.
Hugh Kinsella Cunningham.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Next to Kazakhstan, where the economy is very much on the up. The country's been transformed since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And while Russia remains a key trading partner, its burgeoning relationship with China has boosted investment in infrastructure. Tim Hartley recently returned to the country after a hiatus of some 2 decades, as he followed the Wales football team which was playing there, and saw up close how the country has changed.
Rihanna's mum held the little girl's hands above her head as I got down on my knees to cut a thin blue cord which had been tied around her ankles. By doing this, I was symbolically untethering her, helping 4-year-old Rihanna step into life and wishing her a prosperous and happy future. The Tusaikasa is a traditional ceremony for all children in Kazakhstan, and as a representative of the Wales football supporters charity, Gol Cymru, I was guest of honour during our visit to the Bereke Rehabilitation Centre in the capital city Astana. Today's visit was especially poignant because although the Tusaikasa ceremony is usually performed on a Kazakh child's first birthday, Rihanna has cerebral palsy, and it took 4 years for her to learn how to walk and take her first symbolic steps. After the cord was cut, Rihanna was helped to walk towards a small selection of objects, each one representing a possible path in life: a book, a musical instrument, a coin and a tool. As confetti was showered over her, and to loud applause from family and friends, she went for the toy doctor's set. The Bereke Centre looks after dozens of children with a range of disabilities. Its director is Igul Bulatova, a warm, motherly person her headscarf framing a full, rounded face. Igul established the charity because of her experiences growing up with her own disability, a withered arm. I asked if the Soviet system she grew up in looked after its own. "Ha," she said, "it was truly awful back then. They didn't want to know. We were all poor, and I remember children being tied to their cots to keep them quiet." Igul's daughter, Tomiris, is spending her university gap year working at the Bereka Centre. She spoke with a slight American accent. "Oh, that Netflix," she explained. "Things are very different now from Mum's day." Tomiris told me she was looking forward to one day working abroad, though that might not be necessary. Today, Kazakhstan is experiencing something of a boom. Economic growth was more than 6% for the first half of this year, fuelled by oil and infrastructure projects. As I stepped outside the Bereka Centre, the horizon was dominated by cranes. Astana has been dubbed a mini Dubai, with its high-rise glass and concrete buildings. There's a monorail from the airport into the city being built too. Being the biggest and wealthiest of the 5 former Soviet Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan is taking a leading role in reshaping the region. In July, President Tokayev, a fluent Mandarin speaker, hosted a summit for the leaders of the stands with President Xi of China. China is seen as an important, reliable trading partner. There are plans for an $8 billion regional railway connecting China to Uzbekistan. Despite Russia's historical links with the republics, China is today the top trading partner for all of them. But what price continued economic success? Kazakhstan has long been accused of corruption and human rights abuses. On taking office in 2019, President Tokayev started a series of anti-corruption reforms. But according to Transparency International, the country still has high levels of nepotism and corruption. A few days after taking part in Rihanna's rite of passage ceremony, I flew down to Almaty, Kazakhstan's former capital. I first came here 20 years ago to lecture young reporters on the importance of a free press in the then nascent democracy. The students were bright and keen to learn. They believed that change was coming and that they could help build a new, democratic Kazakhstan. I'm not sure I had much success back then. According to the Freedom House organisation, elections in Kazakhstan today are neither free nor fair, and the dominant media outlets are in the state's control. But people are still lured here. Matisse Olly arrived in Almaty from the Netherlands in 1998 and has set up a string of cafes, one overlooking the central Green Bazaar. Over a cup of coffee, we chatted about the changes he's seen in Kazakhstan. He didn't seem too worried about the current picture. "There's corruption everywhere," he said, "and here's no different. In business, you want stability and decisions made quickly, and they get things done here." As I walked home that evening along the cool boulevards of Almaty, I wondered where those oh-so-keen journalism students of 20 years ago were now. But also, I couldn't help thinking about my new friends back in Astana. When I'd said goodbye to Igul and Tomiris at the Bereka Centre, after her big day, little Rihanna was asleep in the pushchair. She'd just taken her first tentative steps in her brave new world. And outside, Kazakhstan was forging ahead too.
Tim Hartley. And finally, life under the Iron Curtain may seem a far-off memory to some, a part of history immortalised in both films and real-life stories of escapes recounted by relatives. The Berlin Wall became the concrete manifestation of the division between East and West, but it was by no means the only barrier built during this era. John Kempfner travelled to a small village in South Germany that was one day divided by a wooden fence, which changed life forever.
I admit I'm an obsessive. Barely a day passes in Berlin when I don't think about the wall. Whether by the Brandenburg Gate in the centre or in any of the outlying reaches, even now, getting on for 4 decades, I can't get enough of it. I remember living in the East when it came down. That was 1989. Most Berliners don't give it a second thought these days. So it was with some excitement that I recently embarked on a 200-mile meandering car journey to the south of Germany, to the spectacular pine forests and meadows of the Vogtland and the village of Mödlereuth. For this, as the American soldiers dubbed it, was Little Berlin. Throughout the Cold War, its 50 inhabitants, just under 20 households, were divided by a creek so shallow you barely got your ankles wet. By a quirk of topography, this village had the misfortune to straddle the regions of Bavaria in West Germany and Thuringia in the communist GDR. And so the East Germans, under their Soviet masters, built a wall just as menacing as the better-known other one. Even at its founding in 1810, Mödlereuth cut across the Kingdom of Bavaria and the Principality of Reuss, a princely house best known for giving all its male members the name Heinrich and numbering them sequentially by birth. Throughout its history, the inhabitants on both sides of the brook drank in the same pub, attended the same church, and sent their children to the same school. Then came the German surrender at the end of the Second World War. As soon as they marched in, the Russians erected wooden posts by the stream. For a while, villagers could still hop over, though as restrictions tightened, they were required to show ID, even though everyone knew who they were, and to return at night. Then in 1952 came barbed wire, a proper fence, and the formal closing of the border. In 1966, just as in Berlin but 5 years later, a wall was built, with mines, tank traps, and guard posts. The villagers could still see the other side by climbing hills, but on the eastern bank, waving and shouting were prohibited. One woman was put on a Stasi watch list for responding, "Same to you," to a Bavarian villager who wished her Happy New Year. This place felt like the end of the world, its eerie tranquility disturbed only by East German searchlights and the barking of guard dogs. Occasionally on the western side, tourists came to Gorp, sometimes bringing ladders to sneak a look over the Iron Curtain, plus the odd VIP, such as the then American Vice President George Bush Sr. in 1983, who was given a pair of binoculars by the German Defense Ministry. 6 years later, suddenly everything changed. The Berlin Wall, the big one, fell on the 9th of November 1989. In Mödlereuth, it took another month and a series of orderly village meetings for East German border guards to open a chink in their wall. There was no going back. Soon after, a joint association was formed to discuss how to deal with the legacy. Part of the wall, just outside the village and close to the spot of the only successful escape, has been preserved, as have 2 watchtowers. Alongside a series of tableaux explains the most dramatic dates in the village's history. I'm shown around the site by Robert Lebergern, the director who spent much of his working life painstakingly building up the memorial. As we walk, he points out some of the regulations. Farmers needed special permission to tend to their crops. A husband or wife could work the fields alone, but not together, in case they made a run for it. Armed guards stood watch. As an old hand at wall watching, I hadn't expected much, but in its simplicity, this place is incredibly moving, showing the tragedy and absurdity of it all. Now a very modern museum is opening, with a cafe, shop, cinema, and a large car park. It's impressive, but its name, the German Museum, feels a little neutral to me. We simply want to show the facts of division and the effects of division, Robert tells me. I detect he's being diplomatic. The villagers on the eastern side, farmers and craftsmen, lived in what he calls the grey zone, neither supporting nor opposing the regime. The village is still divided, administratively at least, with different car number plates and different postcodes. When the federal president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, recently visited, he was accompanied by the state premiers of both Bavaria and Thuringia, and when his foot crossed the brook, he was formally handed over by one police force to the other. History may have moved on, the border hasn't.
John Kampfner, and that's all for today. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
I'm Ragnar O'Connor from BBC Radio 4 and the History Podcast. This is The Magnificent O'Connors. In war-torn London, a man is murdered. The police arrest 23-year-old Jimmy O'Connor. He's sentenced to death, but Jimmy is my dad. For 80 years, my family has fought to prove his innocence, and now we're making one final attempt to uncover the truth. But are we ready for what we'll find? The Magnificent O'Connors. Listen first on BBC Sounds.
Krasivanova Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.